Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and sorry we had to cut that break a little bit shorter than we hoped, but after the conference we'll have 1 hour together downstairs where we met at lunch to network even more, so I look forward to that as well. But now, as promised, we have another panel debate. It's the final panel discussion of the conference, in fact, and it's called Organised Chaos, Trajectories for Global Governance of AI. And this session will be guided by Joshua from the Brookings Institution. He'll be heading over to Canada in just a minute to hear the view from Simon Kennedy, that's the Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. He'll also be sitting down. You can make your way slowly over here, Joshua. He'll be joined as well by Rebecca Finlay, that is the CEO. Rebecca Finlay is the CEO at Partnership on AI. That's a non-profit bringing together diverse voices from all across the AI community and civil society. Aliki Funikopouli, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name quite right, Senior Director of EU Government Affairs and Public Policy from Salesforce. Please feel free to share with us how you pronounce your name.
It's just the O that's silent. Funikopouli is what's left.
Beautiful. Yeah. Lovely name. We also have Matteo Quattrocchi, the Director of Policy EMEA from the Software Alliance. So good to see you all. We're also hoping, ladies and gentlemen, to cross over to Tanzania and bring in Neema Lugangira. She's an MP, and she's also the chair of the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance. So we might be hearing from her a little bit later. But in the meantime, Josh, over to you.
Yes, great. And I've kind of always had mixed feelings about the title of this summit, this panel, Organised Chaos, but I think it's actually somewhat appropriate. We've heard a lot today already about the multitude of approaches to AI governance. We've had a strong focus on what's been going on domestically. We had a great panel before on what's been happening in the EU, but we've heard also views about what's happening in the US, in Africa, in Brazil, in other countries. We're going to cross to Simon shortly to get a perspective on what's going on in Canada. But we started out this event by having a conversation around the emphasis on domestic AI governance as really being the kind of building block towards forms of international cooperation. And we use this concept of international cooperation in AI governance to speak to the need to build alignment and interoperability amongst different AI governance approaches happening domestically. So the standards conversation that Cam moderated fits into that as a mechanism for building interoperability through standards. There are other approaches to that as well. But there is, of course, also another sort of parallel, complementary possible conversation that talks about international AI governance, which at some levels posits other developments at the international level for governing AI, and this is an opportunity to have a conversation about how that may or may not look. We've got a slightly shorter panel just because the day has been full and we've run a little over time, so I'm going to get right into it. And Simon, I'd love to just turn to you initially. Thanks for your patience and being online. And Canada's doing quite a bit on AI policy, both in terms of legislation, but also in terms of you have centres of excellence. Canada's been one of the sort of prime supporters of GPI. So I'd love to hear sort of broadly about what Canada's doing domestically and how Canada is thinking about cooperation on AI governance as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joshua. I'm really delighted to be able to join you guys virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Some people will know that Canada has made artificial intelligence a priority now for a number of years. We were actually the first, I believe, the first country to have a national strategy on AI. We launched in 2017. We were, I guess, blessed perhaps by luck to have a number of the leading founders of the field be Canadian, and the government of the day took that as an opportunity to build around some of those leaders, Yoshua Bengio, Jeff Hinton, and others, and invested significant money to create 3 AI institutes. And so we have actually quite a stable of scientific and research expertise in this space, and people who have been thinking about issues such as AI safety for a long time. We recently renewed the strategy last year with another significant federal investment, and we In addition to kind of support for research, we added a component for support to commercialization in an effort to try to move a lot of the work kind of out of the laboratory, if you like, and actually into the economy, and, into our healthcare sector, for example, into the financial sector to try to make use of these technologies. As these issues and concerns around the safety, responsible use of AI have grown more and more pronounced over the last number of years, in keeping with this hope that Canada would continue to play a leading role in this space. We did a number of things. The government of Canada actually introduced legislation about a year ago or so now to actually, create a foundational approach to the regulation of artificial intelligence. It's called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. It is now in our House of Commons, moving through the legislative process. We were the second jurisdiction, I think, in the world to have this, at least advanced, democratic jurisdiction to have this kind of effort to kind of regulate and put guardrails around AI after the European Union. That legislation has actually produced a lot of debate, and we've had people, very vocal on one side or the other about the merits of what we're trying to do. Very briefly, for your audience and for the panel, we chose quite deliberately in the legislation to put in place a framework approach, kind of a general, a law of general application that would apply to all activities in the economy. And it was really not designed to have an enormous amount of very precise detail around specific sectors. And the way that I think of it is, it's a little bit like consumer product regulation. Generally, if you go into a large, department store, there are thousands and thousands of different consumer products. And generally, if you look at Canada or the United States, for example, there is legislation on consumer product safety that is meant to be general legislation that sets an expectation that people that manufacture consumer products do so in a way where they exercise due diligence. If they become aware of dangers in their product, they're required to withdraw from the market. They're required to do testing and that sort of thing. But generally, there aren't very, very prescriptive rules set by government around every single consumer product in the market. That would be almost impossible to do. And the innovation happening in the private sector is significant. So every year new products come to market. And so you need rules of general application. So that's what we try to do with our Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, with the plan being that once we have that basic foundation in place, we would then be able to go in and develop very specific regulations about specific aspects of AI and specific issues as they arise. This was partly because what we heard from experts was this is an area that's evolving so quickly that it would be folly to imagine that we have the detailed knowledge now to allow us to regulate with a great deal of precision. And I think we've been validated in that approach, because actually it was after we tabled the legislation that there was this explosive kind of rise in interest in generative AI, ChatGPT-4, coming out into public consciousness, and the rise in concerns about generative AI and large language models. And our view is that legislation actually, that basic kind of foundational approach, serves us well to deal with these kinds of developments. In addition to the legislation, we have been working and actually recently released a voluntary code of conduct, working with our private sector, working with civil society, with an aim being to bridge from now until that legislation comes into force. And that code of conduct, talks about principles such as the need for transparency, focusing on human oversight and monitoring, and it includes things such as developing mechanisms to enable AI-generated content to be detected, such as watermarking. Those who sign on to the code, commit to undertaking, rigorous risk assessment, mitigation, and testing measures, such as, red teaming, for example, when you're developing, new AI products that you would put out into the marketplace, and in committing to information sharing among participants in the AI value chain. And we've had important companies such as Cohere, OpenText, BlackBerry, CGI, and others that have signed on to that. And of course, we've been a very active participant in the international discussions around AI governance. We've been one of the founders of GPay, of course, but very active in the G7 Hiroshima process. The Prime Minister and my minister, the Minister of Industry, were participating in the recent UK summit. And we're very pleased actually to see the evolving international discussion around around governance of AI. I mean, our view is that this is a very powerful general purpose technology. It will undoubtedly reshape every sector from health to transport, to education to finance. And as these systems become, more pervasive and more capable, not only will the potential benefits, be important, but actually the risk will be significant. And if we're going to build public trust, and if we're going to ensure that the benefits of AI accrue, evenly or distributed across society, and that there's a measure, I guess, of kind of, justice in terms of, the access of different regions and different countries to the benefits, and that we are able as humanity to manage the risks, it's going to be very difficult to do that without having some, shared benchmarks around, transparency, responsibility, and so on. So we think that international governance is going to be an important part of the equation, and we think that the work we've done in Canada, would be, we need to be working domestically on these issues if we hope to make a contribution internationally. And we certainly don't see domestic regulation and the development of domestic codes and standards as incompatible with the international dialogue. They really reinforce each other. So I hope that's helpful. That would be kind of a quick overview of what we're doing here in Canada.
No, some of that's very helpful. And one of the conversations that has a theme, at least, I think that's come through today has been this contrast that's been drawn between, whether it's binding or non-binding. And so, the executive order in some sort of formal sense is non-binding. It's unlike legislation. Legislation is binding, and that's the EU approach and others. And Canada has sort of weaved, I think, an approach which binds together what you call general purpose approach through regulation, but then relies heavily on general purpose set of laws through a piece of legislation, and then you're relying quite heavily on regulatory guidance to be adaptive and to provide a lot more of the detail. And I thought your example of how kind of product regulation works actually was quite illuminating in that respect. And so it underscores, I think, that maybe the debate is less about binding, non-binding, but it's more about flexibility, because we're all trying to achieve common goals here, and how do we understand and learn from each other's experience to identify best practices and approaches going forward. So I think the Canada example is a really excellent, third example of how you can combine sort of forms of hard law legislation, but also relying a lot on sort of more nimble regulatory approaches as AI develops and new challenges come forward. I'll come back to you. I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of comment on as I reflect on that, but I'll certainly come back to you again shortly.
Well, just very briefly, I would say, and others are, to be frank, maybe more expert than I am in AI specifically, but I have to say that I'm not entirely certain that the evolution of governance in AI will be a whole lot different from the evolution of governance in other very important, areas of society or the economy that all countries are grappling with. Issues around how you manage national security, how you manage taxation, and so on. I mean, I was the Prime Minister's representative of the G20 years ago, and national governments will inevitably want to set, in some cases, hard rules that reflect the values of their society. It's unrealistic potentially to expect that every country is going to land in exactly the same place. But even if you don't land in the same place, you may well share the same sentiments. You may well share the same principles. So I think, given the pervasive and really transformative nature of AI, every country is going to have to grapple with this. But different societies are going to reach slightly different conclusions about where to set the dial in terms of their own regime. And that's going to inevitably necessitate, a dialogue around interoperability. There may well be some common standards, that arise internationally that perhaps, countries might want to memorialize in a treaty or in a bilateral agreement. So, and then, because of the pervasive nature of the technology, I mean, akin maybe to electricity, you're going to have probably some, combination of hard rules and regulations, but also codes and standards and best practices. Like, I think it's a good thing that, this is going to be an evolutionary process. And I think actually being nimble and recognizing that there's going to be a wide variety of governance tools that are going to come to bear, and that you can have codes and standards and kind of softer approaches coexisting with harder approaches like law and regulation, and you can have voluntary existing with mandatory, and you can have coherence and coordination working alongside more rigorous processes like treaties and so on that are much more binding. And you see that on a whole variety of international governance. So I think, we'll probably have some evolution of the rules, much as we've seen in some other, areas. So I don't know. I hope that's helpful. But I would say, I'm not sure that the governance challenges are a whole lot different than they are in some other, really important areas of the international architecture. Thanks.
No, that's very helpful. And in fact, you've answered the question of the panel, so we might actually finish early. But what I do want to do is take a step back and open it up now to maybe just the foundational question and ask each panel to just reflect on this, which is, given the developments we've been talking about today, why do we need international cooperation? And from your perspective, if you want to sort of get into the types of forms that you think would be kind of most helpful, most productive, and most realistic in terms of what we can achieve. Let me open it up to you.
Sure, thank you. And I think the event today, it's very, very topical, not only because exactly AI is on top of everyone's mind, but it is also coming a week after, what seemed like a culmination of very important events in the US with the executive order, at the G7 level, in the UK with the summit. And I think that by now everyone agrees that international alignment is very important. Now, from the perspective of my company, Salesforce, we are an international company. We were founded in the US, but we have been operating here in the EU since 2000. We have physical operations and customers in many, many different countries around the world. And our customers are also international companies. So there is kind of this chain, let's say, of like the regulatory developments and the regulatory compliance that we will need to do, also the one that our customers need to do. We provide enterprise software solutions, applications to our customers, but we are also very much invested in the cloud, but we're also very much invested in AI for many, many years now. So these are all questions that we haven't been asking ourselves since ChatGPT was out, or for a couple of years now. It's been like a conversation we have been having as a company, but also with our customers. And I think that's an interesting perspective when you look at the value chain or the ecosystem. When we're talking about companies like Salesforce, that we operate in the business to business, the questions about fairness, transparency, safety, protection of data, all our customers have been discussing these things with us. So we have been developing a body of knowledge, let's say, and of course, the right practices, responsible development of our technology, et cetera, for some time now. Exactly because we operate in this international context, we have been advocating, supporting international alignment on any more or less regulatory topic you can think about when it comes to the digital sector. By default, it is the way we believe that, through international alignment, you can build more robust frameworks. You can find more robust solutions to questions that are, frankly, don't know any borders, like the risks about AI. They're not like specified by a country or by the borders of the country or even a jurisdiction. So there are players like the EU, the US, the UK, Canada, Japan, who have been like doing a lot of great work. All these players coming together, but also other jurisdictions that we believe might have important things to say, sitting together at the table with civil society, with industry, with academia, with players. This is the way to go forward when it comes to tackling the full spectrum, really, of harms, because we see some conversations are really focused on the very existential, forward-looking, scenario, sci-fi scenario, almost type of risks. We are also seeing like very important conversations for the day-to-day risks, let's say, or the harms that AI is already causing today. Especially in our sector, we see, like, as I said before, concerns with regard to like the protection of data, the safety of our customers' data, bias, toxicity, things like that. That are a bit more of a tangible concern. So all these different fora, the conversation, the fact that it's happening, it's very welcome. I personally see a sense of urgency shared by many, which sometimes at the international level you don't see that often. So we have seen really, from the moment ChatGPT entered our lives, or the conversation has happened in so many different levels so quickly, and I think it's really astonishing to see the willingness of all these, as I said, nations and different players to get together and discuss and find solutions.
That's fantastic. Regulatory alignment, wherever we can do it, is a plus. I'm going to pick up on that shortly. Matteo, let me turn to you.
It's hard to add more to what's already being said. So I guess we can try and look at it from a slightly different perspective in terms of what it is that we mean with AI governance. Because echoing what Simon has said, there are other fora that have dealt with foundational issues that are horizontal in nature and have put together governments, social forces, and civil society, and private sector, and so forth. One key aspect that is important to keep in mind is that AI is equally foundational, will touch upon a number of different sectors, and there's a lot of experience in those sectors. So the expectation to have AI as a monolith, and then in a system of international AI governance as a monolith that sort of deal with that and put that kind of armor on it, is great, and it would be amazing, but I'm pretty sure you would need an AI to do that, because it would have to put together a wealth of knowledge from a million different sectors that are going to be touched by AI in very different ways. So one important aspect of that is also taking that into consideration, as obvious as it might sound, and not fall into the temptation of wanting to solve everything in one place. One other important aspect, echoing again the experience of Canada and other places, is recognizing the differences that you have at the domestic level, at the regional level, the sub-regional level, as we heard today too. It's important to agree and accept that not one system is better than the other. And that is a risk that as industry you see, and you can translate that into a requirement for interoperability, alignment, but fundamentally not having the expectation that that one particular system is better than the other. Because you might want, again, as Simon said, you might want to get to the same place, but you probably take different ways to get there. If you take the executive order, if you actually look at it, indeed it is not that far away in the approach from what the AI Act is doing, from what Canada is doing. And one might fall into the trapping of call it non-binding, or it's not an actual law, but at the same time it will carry the force of law on a number of things. So it would be reductive to expect that to be then immediately translated into federal law. Probably would be better to have that, but at the same time, it's going to carry a number of obligations. So the ability to have international fora where you can exchange that information and you can talk to your peers, be them governments or private sector or civil society, and understand that your approach is equally valid, and agree, for example, a number of important foundational aspects. What are the principles we're looking for? What are the objectives we want to achieve? What are actually we talking about? Is the terminology and taxonomy is quite important. We've seen now that the US and the EU are discussing that right now. I think the next meeting they will discuss taxonomy and terminology. That probably is one place to start. And then you might go at it in different many ways, but if you can agree to the fact that you all want the same objectives, that can lead to better cooperation at the international level.
Great, thank you. Interoperability, which is a theme that's come through, I think, across the day. Let's get back to that. Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. I wanted to pick up on this dynamic nature of the domestic and the international, and I had the opportunity, I can't believe it was just last week, to be in Bletchley Park, and I chaired the round table that was what should national policymakers do. And I think everybody in this room would be aware. The fear, of course, is that the policymakers and representatives of government would show up with their 2 pages, they would read their prepared remarks, and the round table was over. And there was a part that was certainly that experience. However, I was really heartened to see the level of engagement around the room. Now, it's not just the policymakers, but with industry and civil society representatives as well, really trying to reject the binary between regulation and innovation, despite what they may be positioning externally, really trying to get into the nuts and bolts of what are all of the different levers that governments have, and how can they learn from each other. So all the way from different types of hard law approaches right through to regulatory sandboxes and all of those other things, and capacity building across their populations and skills development and otherwise. So it was a really interesting conversation, and it gets back to your point, which is that I think it was a useful conversation to share their own experiences. And one of the recommendations that came out of that discussion was, how can we be doing more of that internationally? How can we be creating those spaces for policymakers to learn from each other, appreciating that they have to respond within their national context? So linking that now to international collaboration, I come from the Partnership on AI, which is a multi-stakeholder organization. And it's interesting that governments will often say they want to put in place a multi-stakeholder process, or industry will come together in trade associations or otherwise. But there are very few nonprofit organizations, in my experience, that are set up and founded to be multi-stakeholder from the start. So we were founded in 2016 with an investment from Amazon and Apple and IBM, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook at the time. But the interesting thing was we also were founded with an investment from the MacArthur Foundation, and the ACLU in the United States has been an active member of our board right from the very beginning. So we really see our work as being a lifting up civil society and a civil society perspective that is informed across our multi-stakeholder organization. So what does that allow us to do? It allows us, I think, to move more quickly in setting up what we think of as voluntary best practices that really drive changes in practice, but also can inform policy moving forward at the international and at the national level. So 2 examples: every voluntary set of commitments that has come out of governments working with industry has talked about watermarking. But watermarking, as everybody in this room knows, is very complex. How you do it both from a technical capability, how it interacts in different use cases, and then what are the governance mechanisms that sit on top of it. So that's an area that we, for example, have been working on for about 4 years. So identified it very early on, realized that detecting deep fakes was probably not the best way to go, and we needed to focus more on provenance and authenticity. So there's an example where we can do some work early on. We can release a code of conduct. We can bring a community together that's fairly diverse. So TikTok is there, Witness, the human rights organization, BBC, the media organization, can come together to really figure out how to move it forward.
That's great. That's super helpful. And we obviously very much think a multi-stakeholder approach to developing this is essential. And you guys have been doing excellent work in this space. So one of the things that we've been hearing, I think, throughout the day is, it's clear that there's different places where international conversations are happening on AI. We've heard about the role the G7 has played. We've talked a bit about the Trade and Technology Council between the US and the EU. We've mentioned GPI. We're going to hear from Amandeep shortly about the developments that are happening in the UN space. So it's clearly a distributed landscape. There is potentially some way of thinking about this structurally. We saw, for instance, that some of the outcomes from the Trade and Technology Council are sort of fed into the G7 process, such as around the Code of Conduct. That was also then came out of the White House as well in July. So there are linkages that are coming out, but there are also areas of complementarity and overlap. And it's a question, I guess, starting with you, Simon. How do you see this landscape at the moment? Is it a place where we should be at the moment, and this distributed arrangement allows for maybe flexibility and agility, or are we missing something there at the moment that we need to add on or develop?
Well, my own sense, Joshua, is it's a bit too early to tell. I mean, certainly there are voices, prominent voices who have called, for international governance along the lines of, say, an AI version of the International Energy Agency. But I think we have some way to go, would be my sense, before we can make a determination of whether we need a very formalized international organization that coordinates all this. My own personal view is this is a very dynamic area now. I think some of these questions will be answered and will shake out in the next couple of years. I think it's a very positive development that you have, the major powers are all very active in this space, and that you have these dialogues going on at the G7, through the OECD, through GPay. We had, China attend the AI summit in the UK. We have the announcement of the new AI safety institutes that the U.S. and the United Kingdom are going to put together. We're actually examining doing something similar. So I think, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, not deliberately trying to avoid answering your question, but I actually think that, it remains to be seen how all of this evolving work coalesces. I think objectively, it's a good thing that you've got, Europe, the United States, certainly Canada's a small player, but you've got jurisdictions that are actively trying to think through how to govern AI. They're moving to put in place, guardrails and to further develop governance in this space, and that all of these players are actively talking. I think that's all a very, very good development. And then the question becomes, would kind of a loose approach like that, will that be sufficient and where does it lead in the longer term? My own personal view would be, I think we've got to kind of let that process play out. And my own view would be, again, I'm not maybe the world's foremost expert in this space, but it remains to be determined whether or not we need a new formal institutional architecture, or whether something that is a bit more multipolar might work. I mean, I don't want to overdo the analogy, but there's been a bit of a debate in trade circles in the same space. You've got the WTO, and I think everyone agrees that's been a very important institution to help to mediate global trade. But there has been also a school of thought that actually bilateral trade agreements might be the way to go, given that the WTO can only, frankly, achieve so much, and that there are certain kinds of arrangements that countries might want to make, amongst each other that are much harder to do in a multilateral setting. So, without wanting to overdo it, I do think, there probably is some merit to having a more formalized international architecture at some point. But I think there's probably more work to be done for nations and countries to evolve their own thinking, and for the international dialogue to advance before we can get to the point where we start making pronouncements about what things should look like.
No, Simon, that's very helpful. I mean, we started off the day by talking about what's practical, what's doable, and I think keeping the conversation grounded in the realities of politics and geopolitics, and the also pressing need to make progress on AI here and now, considering the time and political capital that would probably take to set up any type of organisation and to make it effective, I think is a really important way that you've grounded that response. So I think that sort of level sets for us really nicely. Alika, let me turn to you. I want to sort of pull out you on this same conversation. Like, how are you seeing the architecture of what's happening internationally? How does it look from where you sit?
It's definitely, a lot of conversations happening, as we said, in different fora. However, there are things, there is convergence on many of the topics. So, and it's also like a lot of the players present in, G7, they have been also very active within the OECD and the UN conversation. So there is like some definitely complementary efforts. There's definitely, I also see it like that, like links of the same chain or of one chain. You can use also like, for instance, the OECD, the language that we saw there about what is AI, the definitions made its way into the EU AI Act. Then the EU AI Act is used as a template for maybe other countries that are thinking about regulation. So there is some continuity there. I think it will be possible that, or I think we will see maybe some of these fora specializing on specific issues. So we talked about safety. Maybe some of these fora look more into these kind of frontier models or the very advanced models. Maybe some fora look a little bit more into the human rights aspects of the uses of AI. Maybe others will look into the perspectives, as we said, of like maybe businesses using AI for more now and here type of concerns. So I think we might be seeing in the next maybe year some more clarity as to how all these things tie up together. As I said before, we have seen everyone reacting to these conversations very, very rapidly. So I think it has created also this kind of, we all need to be there talking to each other. As Simon was saying, it's very, very important. The important thing from my perspective is to make sure that there are some things like very basic concepts like definitions, like the risk-based approach that we were discussing also in other sessions today, like the realization that there is like responsibility for players along the value chain, depending on their role, that everyone has a role to play in making sure that AI is developed and deployed safely. There are some like high-level themes like these and very important concepts that I think would be better decided and agreed at a very horizontal and at the highest level. And of course, there can also be more sectoral approaches. AI is also posing so many questions. You know, we were discussing competition in the previous session, it was mentioned, privacy considerations, copyright, intellectual property considerations as well. And there are already conversations happening at the enforcement agency level. So we saw G7 competition authorities also discussing recently. We saw data protection authorities discussing recently these issues. So I think everyone will find a little bit like their space in that conversation. What I think is important, as I said, is that like big and important fundamental concepts for the risk-based approach, for allocation of responsibility throughout the value chain are agreed at the highest and more horizontal level. And I also think it's very important that these conversations reflect a little bit the whole ecosystem, that there is plurality from nations and countries. It's also plurality from the voices from the industry around the table. We were mentioning before how important this diversity of opinion and different actors getting together. As I was saying at the beginning, I think businesses like Salesforce who have a presence in the enterprise world, exactly because of all the expertise we have developed throughout the years and the fact that we're talking to so many different sectors, there is a specific value for us to participate in these conversations and not only focus on the consumer-facing or mass market software applications or AI applications that sometimes dominate the conversation.
Yeah, that's actually very helpful. I think that really kind of lays out a landscape that kind of complements what Simon said. I just want to pull out a couple of key themes and then turn it over to this side of the panel. It seems to me that one of the things that AI is clearly challenging both domestically and internationally is we need to think very innovatively about how we approach it. We've used a lot of analogies, seatbelts, to take one example, which has been illuminating in part because it's sort of revealed how different AI and the challenges and opportunities and risks are to previous sort of innovations and technologies. And I think that's also true when we think about governance, in that we have sort of mechanisms we've developed for particular opportunities and challenges, the WTO, for instance, being one, the IAEA being another, but again, AI in some respects is different. And you both have outlined sort of this multifaceted world where you have forms of binding commitments, a lot of voluntary approaches, you emphasize cooperation, there's a lot of bottom-up approaches as well that will filter up, and thinking about this in this kind of multifaceted way sort of challenges, I think, typical binding, non-binding, international, non-international, and so forth. One of the so I want to I put that out there, and I'd love any kind of responses to that. The other piece I want to ask you is, one of the points I think has been made repeatedly throughout the day is we need to get our definitions down, and maybe that is something we need more international attention on, and alignment on some of these big points where I do think we are increasingly getting alignment, such as risk-based regulation. How do we think about conformity assessment and so forth? Any reflections on that in the context of where you're seeing the AI governance space developing at the moment?
Yes, and I think it's interesting, just to build up on Aliki's and Simon's point, how it's simultaneously, in a way, it's too early to tell, and it's already been told, because AI is not this thing that develops outside of Earth and then just folds on us, and then all of a sudden we have to design a completely new infrastructure for everything AI does. AI is being integrated in sectors that already are regulated. So how do we help those sectors implement, enforce, adapt, update, scale down, scale up the rules that already exist? And that's a place where you can have international AI governance, because then you can exchange best practices, you can exchange what your considerations are in specific fields. And I think, for example, one incredibly important point that Vice President Harris made last week is even the concept of existential threat, how relative that might be. So as you start to translate that, you have this kind of two-way cross-pollination between what is international and what is domestic, and at the same time what's horizontal and what's sectoral, and you kind of have to find a way to make all of that work together. And it can be translated into something we can call interoperability, which I think is sometimes a misnomer for the way that legislation and essentially different legal perspectives can work together. It makes you think more of a machine, right? It's not really how that works. The body of law is much more alive, and I think all of us are bred into this kind of legal traditions that the law evolves, and the way that the US might do case law is completely different the way that EU might do it. We heard today a very important point about the importance of not thinking exclusively through the lens of some specific legal traditions, and now Africa is somehow right now just watching what happens and see what washes over them. That's absolutely not the right approach, because it's important to make sure that whenever a regulatory framework, a voluntary framework is implemented and put to work in an African country, it's recognized just as valid as others. So how do we benefit also from the understanding that there are countless experts in their specific sectors that are seeing AI being deployed, let's say in banking? How do we have an expectation that World AI Commission is able to regulate everything on AI, give you all these principles without listening to them? They're seeing it on the ground. So it is too early to tell, but at the same time, we do have international organizations that have built on this ability to be horizontal and high level, but then also kind of let go a bit of that ability. The WTO is one excellent example, another the UN to a degree. So maybe that's also a template we can follow, but at this stage, even building up a World AI office, however you want to call it, it would be such a monumental effort that by the time you're done, you have to hire so many people to actually catch up that you have to start over again.
Yeah.
I would absolutely agree, and I agree with Simon's comments right off the top. And I don't think that means we're not doing something. I think that's the important message we need to deliver. In fact, there are many, many efforts underway, regionally, domestically, and internationally as well. And I think those need to keep moving forward. And it's been interesting, I think, to see the relative level alignment that, in terms of what the G7 is doing, in terms of the White House commitments that kicked off very early on. Now we're seeing other commitments. There's a fairly general alignment around where those are falling. And so that's good, because that can happen, and we can keep moving forward with what we're doing. In terms of all the proposals that have been made, I'm not even sure about the IPCC model that a lot of people are talking about. It is unclear to me, one, that we have the scientific capacity within the AI community to stand up something similar to the IPCC, and that there's enough even scientific consensus out there with regard to the current path from what we are currently calling foundation versus frontier, nor do I think, in terms of figuring out how the member states would get involved in that work. Now, that may be something that evolves, and I'm looking forward to seeing that, and I know it's a strong point that many people are advocating for, but it's not clear to me yet that can happen. And it comes back to Elham's comments this morning about the need for the scientific underpinnings of this technology. And the one thing that Simon didn't mention, but as a Canadian I have to mention, is that one of the reasons why Canada has such a strong research base was because of the very early investment in publicly funded science and research that happened across Canada, particularly when it came to engineering, early work on robotics and AI and otherwise. And so if there was one thing I would say, it's the work in, whether it's Horizon Europe or the work that's happening out of NSF and elsewhere across different jurisdictions, the need for publicly funded open science with regard to AI is crucially important. Too much is happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, it's interesting, the IPCC, because we had the conversation from the Irish minister earlier today, where they had stood up an independent expert to sort of talk about the latest in AI science, and that been an interesting and a seemingly positive experiment at a domestic level. The IPCC, of course, is not an international organisation; it's a network of scientists, and that's different. And there is a question, I think, around, unlike climate change, which can be studied, out in the field, we would need to get access to foundational AI models held by the private sector. So I hear that there's a lot of challenges with that. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I have plenty more questions from the panel, but I want to give the audience an opportunity to come in. So raise your hand if you have a question, and we have a microphone. Yes, gentleman over here to start with.
Thank you. Robert Whitfield from the One World Trust. I've been very struck that, today it's about global AI conference. Today's panel was on the trajectories for global governance, and yet there's been no reference to the Global Digital Compact. There's been one reference to the high-level advisory board on AI, which seems strange. And so I'd be interested in the panel's view on those processes. I know we're going to hear Amandeep sing shortly, but what are your views about the current UN processes and whether AI should be part of the Global Digital Compact, if it should be separated out? What are your views?
Yep. Anyone want to kick off on that?
I don't have a view on the Global Digital Compact. That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. With regard to the UN, I think that Amandeep is doing a very good job of building a community to raise awareness, which I think is one of the things that the UN can do very well, is take a human rights approach to raising awareness and also bringing many, many other voices around the table with regard to AI. I will be interested to see the work that that group is going to do moving forward, but I'm actually quite happy to see that that has been stood up, and I think there's a very important role for the UN to play. And just coming back, I am on the science question. I'm quite interested to see what happens with the safety institutes, because that could create the network that allows for some of this international work to happen as well.
Simon, do you want to come in on that question at all?
Sure, I have a whole lot more to add. I would say we're obviously interested in the work, but what is striking to me is the sheer number of bodies where this is an active dialogue: the G7, the G20, the TTC, the OECD, GPA, the Freedom Online Coalition. There's a lot of players that are active in this conversation, and we're involved with all of them. But I don't have a particular view on that particular forum and its role.
And there's clearly a conversation which we were going to have a more deeper conversation around access in the African context, because there is, I think, a question around the SDGs, development, the role of technology broadly, but certainly artificial intelligence in kind of enabling that to happen, and what we have in place and what we don't have in place. It's not necessarily, I think, an AI-specific conversation, because it's a broader technology enabling access development conversation. But I think the AI conversation, for what we've had today, really adds additional kind of need to have that be real, because the digital divide potentially widens rather than narrows if we don't make progress there. Cam.
Thank you. So my question is to Rebecca. You mentioned that at Bletchley there was a lot of focus on what are the levers that governments have, and I wonder in that context how the executive order that Anu Bradford called the mother of all AI laws was received and looked at as a roadmap for pushing levers across a variety of sectors.
Well, certainly from my perspective, it was remarkable to see the executive order come out 2 days before the safety summit. And as with all, has anybody read the whole order? Anybody in the room made it to, oh my gosh. I'm so impressed. So this is, really significant and comprehensive as a government, as we've talked about earlier today. So I think it in some ways it set the baseline for the conversation going into the summit, in that it was a recognition that, in this case, the U.S. government was prepared to take significant domestic action with regard to what we're broadly defining as safety, but also brings into the TAFE. And I think that was the other piece probably of the executive order, right? Was that it was broadly defined, not just in terms of frontier safety, for what that means, but really thinking about current harms as well, whether it was worker protections or bias and discrimination or otherwise. So I think that was very, very important.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, Christophe Zeng. I'm the founder of World Artificial Intelligence Supervision Commission Association in Geneva, and as well as some other associations. I set up a lot of associations. Well, if that civil society commission already existed, and the plan already existed, and even the headquarters had already been identified, and the adoption was only a political will, depending on some geostrategic choices. How would you see this panel or the European Union or the different stakeholders engage each other for maybe adopting or not adopting, at least having an answer for this?
Okay. Anyone want to?
I just want to make sure I understood the question 100%. You're talking about the one international body that would supervise or
rule them all,
regulate.
Yeah. The one ring.
Hybrid between the UN and the different, and then since the UN is has some advantages and disadvantages, then this entity or this set of entities can take the relay on speed and
I don't think there is. I mean, personally, I don't think there's like a perfect answer, like the perfect institution, body, agency, whatever you want to call it. Exactly for the reasons that I mentioned before. AI touches upon so many different things. Either you need to find really experts on all the different questions arising from the very important, like human rights questions, where maybe the UN has more to offer, to competition concerns, to data privacy and protection, to cybersecurity and safety concerns. I think it's going to be more of a effort like where more players will actually provide like their expertise. Now, when it comes to like how the EU might be cooperating, I think the EU is very keen on taking a leadership role, and rightly so, because they do have the expertise, the know-how about regulation and many of these safeguards. I'm very pleased from the perspective of my company to see how the EU is endorsing these international conversations. They were discussing with the US on a code of conduct even before the G7 kind of came into that conversation, and they were very eager on getting like input from industry. So I think they are really making the effort. More than that, I think it's a question more for government officials, to be honest with you, to answer. But again, I'm going back to the point that at the moment what we see is a lot of willingness. How exactly will translate into in practice, what that would look like might be a bit of an open question for now.
Yeah.
Joshua?
Yeah, Simon, you want to come in on that? Yep.
Just very briefly, and I'm sorry, I want to sort of, provide, I guess, a statement of the obvious, but I had this experience many years ago working as a government official, but kind of dealing with the shipping industry. And this was in the wake of the Exxon Valdez oil disaster in Alaska. Some people might remember there was a large super tanker that broke up and was, kind of created headlines, certainly in the United States. And the U.S. Congress, within a very short space of time, passed legislation to dramatically strengthen the rules around oil tankers and so on. The reason I'm telling you this story is there was longstanding international governance around shipping on the high seas, including standards for marine oil tankers and pollution prevention and this sort of thing. And and that had been around a long time under the UN system and so on. And when Congress decided actually the standards weren't good enough and just unilaterally made a move, it actually dragged most of the rest of the world along with it. And the reason being, if most shipping companies want to be doing business with the U.S., and the U.S. became a bit of a pace setter because they just said if you're going to dock in the U.S. port, you have to follow our rules. And I think that analogy kind of holds here, like the fact that the U.S. Some of these international institutions and architecture we're talking about, the UN system and so on, are really important, and we shouldn't in any way dismiss them. But I think realistically, they're only likely ever going to be, useful as a role to, in a sense, set some minimum standards, try to socialize, and bring a kind of a bit of an international baseline to whatever activities, whatever regulatory or legal activities that countries choose to do in the AI space. But at the end of the day, the major powers in this space that have the tech companies, that have the economic clout, such as the United States, such as Europe, I mean, realistically, they're going to be key players in determining what the rules look like. And so the fact that the Americans came out with this executive order with extensive rules, that's going to, in effect, that's, as Canadians, we're aiming to play a meaningful role. We actually have things we can contribute. But when a country with 20% of the world's GDP and most of the major platform companies and some of the and a huge amount of the critical mass in AI decides that it's going to set a certain set of rules, let's not kid ourselves. That's going to be a major development in what the international architecture will eventually look like. And at some point, obviously, the Chinese and others are going to, they'll be jockeying and jostling. But I think, the dynamic between the major, superpowers in this space and how they choose to act and what kind of rules they choose to put in place and how that then transmits into the global governance is important, because we can talk about these international institutions. We need to contribute to those. We want to have some multilateralism in this space. But I think at the end of the day, and it was ever thus, those who are the biggest, players and have the most clout, in some respects, are going to, play a significant role in determining what the global architecture looks like. And I think we're already seeing that happen with with the moves the European Union and the Americans are making in this space.
Yes, Simon, that's a very helpful, I think, perspective. I guess it's a little like how the WTO developed with the Green Room process, the Quad, which was then kind of broadened out to other countries. And I think the realism that you kind of bring to this in terms of how this might develop is very kind of helpful. We've got one, but did you want to come quickly on Simon's?
And then just add, it's undeniable that that's the effect, right? Like that's the EU and the US and other players in the world are going to be trendsetters. At the same time, I think it's interesting to also look a bit at the threads of policy priorities you have. And certain places are in different stages of where it is, but as much as it's a buzzword, like a risk-based approach, it is what most countries are looking at. The EU is looking at it. You may be far ahead in having determined what the risks are, what the use cases are deemed risky. Others might be at the stage where they're analyzing their legislation. I think one piece of the work that the HLAG in Europe did, which is often overlooked, is the second part of the guidelines, which is looking at EU legislation. What do we have? How do we make it work with AI? That it's an important piece, and many countries are doing that right now. That doesn't mean they're not doing anything, as Rebecca was saying. It's a very important part of what you're doing. But fundamentally, you're seeing that the policy trends are there. You have a mixture of binding rules and at the same time a mixture of voluntary rules. You have roughly an umbrella of horizontal rules. The EO is in a way, executive order is in a way that, the AI Act is definitely that, and then it often goes down vertically. So yes, there are trendsetters, but in a way, they're also the trends that are already there in a way, because the technology itself lends itself to that kind of approach. Because eventually, because it's such a horizontal technology, you are faced with the insurmountable challenge of either regulating with an omnibus piece of legislation that is the be-all, end-all, one ring to rule them all kind of legislation, or you go down vertically at some point. So I think that's there, and maybe your one AI office might not be the one that puts together binding regulation, but definitely puts together a network to share information. And it goes back to the interoperability, so to speak, question. How do we make those different frameworks work with each other? And that's where international AI governance can help.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you for your patience. Over to you.
Thank you. I will be a little bit challenging about that. But, it seems to me that there is something which is missing, which is how could we use also AI to do a different AI governance? And in fact, we should probably think about how AI can help to do some collective decision completely differently. And in fact, this is also something that we should think about, which is not just trying to put a governance for AI, but also try to use AI to do a different governance for AI, but also for international governance globally.
Yeah, I love you've opened that Pandora's box with 1 minute to go. Can any of the panelists want to respond to how AI can help govern itself?
I can bite.
Yes, Simon.
I'll be very brief. Just to say, well, I agree with that comment. When we were developing our AI legislation, we spoke to a lot of experts, and one thing we did hear was, don't kid yourself that even some of the developers of these sophisticated systems know exactly, how they function and exactly how the algorithm's operating. And actually, we need to allow space for AI, for sort of the private sector to actually play a role in self-regulation, play a role in harm identification. So I definitely agree that we shouldn't come with the presumption that say nation states or governance are going to be sort of omniscient and know exactly how to sort of put the guardrails in place. We should allow space, and indeed in Canada our legislation envisages that we allow some space for the private sector to innovate and bring forward innovations that will help to ensure that we have good guardrails. So I just want to say, Joshua, I just endorsed, at least at a conceptual level, what the member of the audience there said. Thanks.
I agree, and it's a monumental amount of information you're looking at. And to echo some of the comments made in the previous panel, unfortunately, sometimes the need for that amount of information to be factored in the policy decision is just not sacrificed, but somehow put aside for the political expedient of actually getting legislation done. At the same time, you do have technology that might be able to give you at least a degree of understanding of how things work. And obviously, you're not going to ask the AI what they think about being legislated. That would be a very, very interesting question to pose to certain models. But at the same time, if I can pivot towards the answer saying it's really important to keep the flow of information in the policymaking activity throughout the process. It's just as iterative as you get there to the proposal as it is afterwards, as you're about to finalize, as you put it into force. So maybe a trustworthy AI that helps gather all that information, that's definitely something that policymakers could use.
I should use.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just a couple of things. First of all, I think it's a great idea. I think we have a pretty good understanding of when we deploy AIs into low resource settings, and government is often a low resource setting. I would just want us to be super cautious about thinking about relying on it for efficiency when there may be decisions that need to be made, and make sure we've got the right human oversight in place to make that happen. Having said that, we're all here in this room because we may be talking about safety, but really we believe that AI has the transformative potential to drive innovation, to drive better quality of life and benefits for the people around the world. And I am concerned that the current debate about safety is overtaking the debate about how do we innovate responsibly to drive benefits for people, and how do we widen the number of small to medium-sized enterprises and otherwise, and governments that are using AI to actually drive benefit.
Great, that's great, thanks.
I think that's the perfect maybe conclusion also, because we're talking about safe design, deployment, adoption of AI solutions. I think is also, together with deployment, a conversation we also feel hasn't been explored enough, because we're talking about the risks and the dangers, but how actually the potential that is out there, and how to make sure that responsibly you harness all the different solutions. I think that's something still missing a little bit from the policy debate.
Well, that's great. I'm going to have to wrap up, unfortunately. Like the other panels, there's a lot there that we could still get into. I like the idea. I think where there's human feedback reinforced learning, which makes foundational models more accurate, we can use AI to make AI governance more effective. So that's part of our marching orders. I think one of the things that came out from this panel at least was let's, an international organisation, international body, maybe one day, but that's not where we should be putting our focus and attention at the moment. The domestic governance that's evolving is going to be central, and building interoperability, I think, amongst them will be absolutely key. But then we need to be thinking about creative other forms of building linkages, self-regulation, codes of conduct, being adaptive and nimble as technology develops and new challenges are on the horizon. And I think, this AI governance piece also leaning into the multi-stakeholder approach, right? Like really, what do we mean when we talk about bringing in the private sector in a genuine way to really help government understand what is needed and what the processes are, and how can they actually contribute to better governance and better outcomes, I think is clearly going to be part of it going forward as well. So let's thank the panel for what I thought was a very rich and important discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joshua, as well, and all our moderators that you've met on stage throughout the day. I'm going to take a seat here because, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming almost to the end of our International AI Summit, but we've still 3 keynote speeches for you. And as we've been hearing all throughout the day, AI, it feels a little bit like the World Cup of AI, with everyone talking about AI and everyone taking on AI, including the UN. And just last week, of course, we saw the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, announce the creation of a new advisory board to tackle AI. So for more on that, we can now bring in Amandeep, Singh, Gill. Hello, lovely to see you. Your name has popped up a lot today at the International Conference, so we're delighted that you can be with us here. You're live in Brussels with an audience of about 200 people and about 1,000 people tuning in online all across the place. So we're delighted to hear from you and hear your take now, and hand over to you.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts from the UN's perspective. Now, the UN is not a newcomer to this conversation. I think we have to get this narrative straight. From the beginning of his mandate, the Secretary General has emphasized the importance of digital cooperation, emphasized the importance of addressing both the misuse and the misuse of digital technologies, the opportunities that need to be harnessed to accelerate progress on the sustainable development goals while protecting humanity against harms, understanding and responding to the risks to human rights, to human agency, fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law. And most importantly, to address what has been referred to as the digital divide. There is an essential connectivity divide. People, 2.7 billion, don't even have access to the internet. Many of them don't have, even if they have access, they don't have meaningful and affordable access in their own language, in their own context. And then on top of that, we have these growing data and AI divides. So there are plenty of reasons why for the past 6 to 7 years, the SG has been emphasizing this issue. And then we've been engaged in work across the UN system. I had the privilege of chairing for 2 years in 2016, 2017, the negotiation on lethal autonomous weapon system, where AI as applied to weapons, how does it impact on international humanitarian law, safety and security? I mean, we've been having a recent conversation on safety and security. And this is something that's been around for a while in certain contexts. I would also point out, since you're meeting in Brussels, the work that's been done at UNESCO on AI ethics. Now, coming to the advisory body that has been launched recently, this was proposed by the Secretary General in his roadmap on digital cooperation about 2 years ago. And obviously, there was, people asked, oh, why do we need this kind of a global expert group? And here we are, nearly 2 years later, when everyone is talking about scientists need to come together. They need to understand this problem for us, lay out in a science-based, evidence-based manner, what's the direction of technology, what are the risks and challenges, and we need to do it fast. So obviously, this is a theme that's important. And we have set about this in the manner which is best suited to a universal forum, that's the UN, which means that it cannot be scientists and experts from one geography or one set of stakeholders. It has to be global, broadly representative, diverse, gender balanced, and also balanced in terms of different stakeholders, governments, the private sector, and civil society, which includes the tech community, independent tech experts, academia, and civil society activists. So this body of 39 members has elected 2 co-chairs, Carme Artigas from Spain, James Manieka from Zimbabwe, coming out of the government and the private sector stakeholder groups. And it's been given a task, and the task is come up with interim recommendations by the end of the year that cover, one, the risks and challenges. And it's not only a risk conversation, it's also a challenges conversation, which impact on the risks, the pace of tech development, the opacity around some of these AI models, they complicate our responses to the risks. So they have to be looked at as well. And it's not only a conversation about existential risks, long-term risks, but also about the now risks to misinformation, the integrity of public information, to discrimination, human rights. So some of the medium-term risks around shifts in the job marketplace. And I think we've had this experience with globalization. Politicians have had to deal with Rust Belts and so on. There were references to WTO in the previous panel. So this is not only a conversation about what could go wrong today, what could go wrong 50 years from now, but what could politicians and our social protection institutions might be facing a few years down the lane. So we need to have this balanced and comprehensive assessment of risks and challenges. That's one. The other one is opportunities and enablers. I'm a skeptic, having worked for 3 years in the practical applications of AI in the health space. I'm very enthusiastic about the technology. I love the potential to bridge the last mile gap in delivery of health, education, other services. I also love the potential it has in accelerating R&D, scientific. Some of the skepticism around international responses. Oh, but the WTO is deadlocked. The Conference on Disarmament can't get to consensus on its program of work. But then we are selecting our data set, with certain things in mind. If we broaden it, there are many things that work on an ongoing basis without attracting much attention. And the Wi-Fi routers we use, the standards behind those, the planes that fly, the baggage that gets shifted around, baggage belts. So that's all in response to that smoothness, that interoperability, those safety, security, standardization aspects are coming out of international institutions. However you may wish to place them. Safety Summit that took place in London recently, the US executive order, and I could go on. There are many of these. There's a proliferation of responses as people realize the potential impact and the economic and social consequences of wide-scale AI deployment and respond to it. There's, of course, some competition, because that's always been the case. The stronger powers then try and set the rules early. My experience of 30-odd years in international diplomacy around science, around strategic technologies is that power diffuses. You face surprises. We face several surprises in the nuclear domain. So you need to have institutions. You need to have international collaboration, multilateral collaboration. Major powers are not always enthusiastic about these institutions because they imply sharing of power. They imply sharing of power with those who may not have those capabilities. But that's the true essence of democracy. That's the true essence of multilateralism, the essence of the UN Charter. And it's important that we make sure that diverse voices are on the table. At the end of the day, if AI matters for humanity, for good or for bad, it's a moral and a practical imperative for us to ensure that all of humanity is engaged in that conversation. And I want to conclude by mentioning the Global Digital Compact. I heard someone from the audience mention that. Thank you, sir, for highlighting that. Next year, we have several summits that are taking place, but we have a summit of summits next year. That is the Summit of the Future, all 193 member states of the United Nations will come to New York for a summit meeting. It's really a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The Global Digital Compact is one of the 5 outcomes that will be attached to the Pact for the Future. It's the main outcome of that summit. And AI is one of the 8 themes in the Global Digital Compact. And the advisory body's work would feed into the Global Digital Compact negotiations next year. So that gives us an opportunity to capture the insights from this inclusive, diverse, globally representative body, scientific, multidisciplinary body, into that decision, so that our responses, whatever be the nature of those responses, as part of this ecology of responses, as part of this nested response from governments, national jurisdiction, and the private sector, whatever be that, it is made sustainable for the benefit of all humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amandeep. And stay with us there, because I'd like to ask you a couple of questions and also look around the room in case there are any questions specifically for you. It's great that you could listen in earlier to the conversations that we were having before. One you might have missed, though, was earlier when we spoke about China. And China seems to be very happy that the UN is taking on this role in the field of AI and wants the UN to play an even bigger role here, setting the goalposts when it comes to AI. So what will your role be in bringing the world together here in this field?
Yes, but it's not only China. At the UKI summit, for instance, you had Brazil, Indonesia, Kenya, Rwanda, Spain, the Netherlands, all speaking for a stronger role for the UN. So I would say there is a majority out there, a large majority, that is keen on a UN role. But what kind of a UN role? And that's something to be determined. The Secretary General is very clear that, we are there to help if asked, if invited. There are certain things that, can be done through the UN. So we are ready to take on that responsibility, building on the foundation that we have. It's also a question of legitimacy, about the question of credibility, and what kind of a foundation you want for international governance of AI. Is it based in the human rights conventions, the UN conventions, those core conventions that are already there, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the SDGs framework, the UN Charter, or do we kind of, craft a new basis for that? The geopolitical competition is there. It's the drivers are quite fundamental, but I think we have a window of opportunity. Before we have a kind of a bifurcation or a trifurcation or whatever you want to believe in, and people start to follow their own path, and you get into a kind of a arms race dynamic. I think there's an opportunity to bring some basis for collaboration and bend the arc of investments in the direction of common benefit.
And just on geopolitics, because of course AI is impacting geopolitics on a daily basis. So what concerns do you have about how AI could actually spread deep fakes, and how democracy could be undermined by AI technology? Next year we have, of course, big elections in DC, we've big elections as well here in Europe, and 65 different elections all across the world.
Yes, India. So I think a majority of the world's population is going to the polls next year. Deep fakes are a concern. The dropping cost of misinformation, disinformation, the realism that you can paint onto these things, that's a concern. And I think we are in a longer term sense, we've been leeching agency to technology for a while. So AI is going to accelerate that trend. So humans are cognitively lazy. So we like others to take care of things, and tech steps in beautifully. So as information is mediated, as human behavior is kind of through nudges, through recommendations, directed in one place or the other, we need to be careful about at what point, because these layers kind of stack up, and then, where this influence is coming from, you lose sight of that. This can have serious consequences for democratic participation, for the distance, between our political leaders, elected leaders, and citizens. And these are things that we haven't. I mean, focusing on misinformation, disinformation is important, but sometimes it occults this kind of a deeper phenomena. So that worries me. And I also worry about the impact on social protection, our social contract, the institutions we have today for dealing with marginalized people, even within advanced societies. That has an implication in terms of populism, has an implication in terms of societal harmony and unrest. So those, again, I mean, these are indirect effects of AI, job market, concentration of economic wealth, and so on. But they'll come back to haunt us in terms of rule of law, democracy. And then the third point here is that governments, frankly, some governments may weaponize AI for surveillance, for violating human rights, and so might companies in the sense of, there is a certain incentive structure, quarterly earnings, earning calls, what are my investors going to say, etc. So they may put profit first. And so therefore, there may be those kind of consequences which restrict civic space, which restrict the space available to individuals to kind of be creative and, be sometimes, like Foucault said, being in the moment and constructing our own reality from that point on, those things might get restricted.
Okay, Amandeep, we just have 2 minutes left on the clock. If there's anyone here in the room who would like to make a comment or question for you. I think people are getting a bit tired here. We have been in the room since 9 o'clock this morning. Andrea, you've got, yeah?
All right. Hello, Amandeep. This is Andrea Renda. Good to see you. I have 2 quick comments and see whether you want to react to them. One is the work on human rights, right? Knowing one of the 2 co-chairs, Carmen Artigas, she's done quite a lot of work of neuro rights or rights in the digital age, right? Do you think that the human rights framework would need to be expanded in view of getting ready for the future, right? And in particular for the summit on the future. And the second thing that I wanted to say is, of the many things that the process that the UN has kickstarted might achieve, perhaps the most difficult, or the one that, in my opinion, we are the furthest away from, is finding a mechanism for ensuring that the less developed countries partake in the benefits of AI. So is there a way to imagine transfer of knowledge, empowering, creating and retaining values in low and middle income countries? Do you see any such things coming out of the high-level multi-stakeholder group or not?
So you've
Should I go
45
ahead?
seconds to answer that. Amandeep.
Thank you, Andrea. The second question first. Yes, there is a way, focusing on the enablers and coming out with specific concrete suggestions. We have some ideas that we want to operationalize also in the context of the Global Digital Compact. Within the group, the advisory body, there is a group that's specifically looking at opportunities and enablers, and hopefully we'll come out with some ambitious recommendations. And on your point about human rights, I think they are an essential foundation for AI governance, and that also allow us to hold people accountable. So it's an accountability framework as well. I don't know if we need new human rights, but we certainly need to refresh our understanding of existing human rights and how they apply in the context of these emerging technologies, not only AI, but neural and potentially other technology. That's ongoing work in Geneva and elsewhere, and we will facilitate that also through the Global Digital Compact.
Okay, and here we'll keep an eye on that report coming out a little bit later this year. Not a lot of time for you to get working on that, so best of luck with that. Amandeep, and thank you so much for joining us here today at the International AI Summit here in Brussels. Take care. A round of applause for Amandeep.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So now we've heard from the UN, we can now get the view from DC, because of course we've spoken a lot as well today about the White House's executive order. It's created ripples in this town and an outburst of reactions. So let's now bring in Alan Davidson, that's the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communication and Information at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Good morning to you. It's about 11 o'clock there, is it?
It is. Good morning, and delighted to be joining you.
Well, you can bring some energy into the room, because we have been here, 250 of us in the room since 9 o'clock, having intense conversations, getting deep, getting complex. It's nearly the end of our conference. After, you will be hearing from the EU Commissioner, Věra Jourová. But first, you know, what is the mood over there in DC? I mean, a lot happened in the last couple of days.
Well, I think the mood is good, and I think people are feeling very engaged. Like, the sense of urgency of the moment is really upon us.
Okay, and I believe you have some other words to share with us today. You've prepared a couple of, I mean, it's called a keynote speech. We'll just call it, you know, what more can you tell us really about this executive order, how it will change the world as we know it when it comes to AI?
Excellent. Well, why don't I say a few words, and I'm really glad to take questions and talk to you more about anything that's come up during the course of the day. And I will say, I really am excited. Thank you, Maeve, and thank you to Forum Europe and the organizers for inviting us to join you at what is really an exciting and historic time to be discussing international work on AI issues. And we're here today because of the growing power of technology in our daily lives. As I'm sure you've been talking about all day, advances in artificial intelligence systems are going to bring enormous benefits to people. You know, from drug discovery to precision agriculture, AI tools will change lives. It is also now clear that there's cause for concern about the risks and the potential harms from AI system use. And we know we will only realize the promise of AI if we address the serious risks that it raises. You know, new AI and machine learning systems present a spectrum of new risks. We're already seeing some of those across the globe, such as the use of AI for targeted surveillance or censorship. Other more emergent or long-term risks have also received a lot of public attention, including some of the threats to safety and biosecurity, cybersecurity. But those, you know, those serious concerns over new risks should not mask the current risks and the real harms faced in the deployment of machine learning systems today. Those include concerns about safety, security, privacy, discrimination, bias, risks from disinformation, which I know have come up, impact on the labor market. And so, as Vice President Harris said ahead of last week's UK Safety Summit, you know, we must manage all these dangers to make sure that AI is truly safe. And I will say, and as I said at the top, there is a sense of urgency across the Biden administration on a path forward in this space. President Biden's AI executive order, which we think is the most significant action any government has taken on AI, brings the power of the US government to bear in a wide range of areas to manage AI's risks and to harness its benefits. That's very important. The executive order offers I think what we think is a sweeping framework. It harnesses every facet of our federal government. Among other things, it will lead to the development of guidance for clearly labeling AI-generated content. It will require developers of the most powerful AI systems to share their safety test results, I should say, with the US government. And it's also going to offer resources for research and broader engagement in the development of trustworthy systems. And notably, I should say, the executive order also directs federal agencies to modern and streamline their visa criteria to welcome talent from across the globe. So we're hoping that we'll be doing more hiring in the US, note to folks in the room there. The order builds on the commitments that President Biden secured from leading AI companies this last summer. And these are all important steps forward. But I will say we're also quite clear our work does not end here, which is why today's conversation is so important. AI is a global issue. Math does not stop at the border. And the United States is working closely with like-minded countries to promote transparency, information sharing, and interoperability with the goal of harmonizing our policies on AI. We reached a major milestone last week with the G7's announcement of an international code of conduct for developers of advanced AI systems. And this code is consistent with, builds on the voluntary commitments that we've secured from leading AI companies. I think you could view it also as a big signal about where the world's leading democracies are heading in terms of what they expect from AI developers and ultimately deployers. We're hoping that this international code of conduct can be used and expanded to guide developers of advanced AI systems as they operate. We look forward to engaging, to continuing to engage, I should say, with our international partners on this effort. Domestically, I'd say, we at the Commerce Department and NTIA are doing our part. You've heard earlier from our colleagues at NIST about their important work, the risk management framework, which has been a huge contribution, and now we'll go further. The new AI Safety Institute that was launched just last week, among many other things. We are also deeply engaged in a project we started earlier this year on AI accountability policy. We've posed this question: what policies are needed to make sure that AI systems are actually behaving the way that they say they are? And you can think of how audits have helped create trust in the accuracy of financial statements. Similarly, accountability mechanisms for AI are going to help ensure that an AI system is working the way it says it's going to work and that it is trustworthy. And we do think that public policy was necessary in certain ways to make that happen in the financial sector. And it may very well be necessary here too to create a good AI accountability ecosystem. So stay tuned there for our coming policy recommendations. And then just to conclude this initial set of thoughts, I just say safe and trustworthy AI innovation across the globe. It's a pretty ambitious effort. Given the growing role of AI systems in all of our lives, it's actually about far more than just this technology or technology policy. It's about creating economic opportunity and new jobs. It's about improving equity. It's about promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms around the globe. Those challenges are daunting, but I will say I'm encouraged by one thing, which is all of you here in the room and listening in to this conversation. Because conversations like this one, and like the ones that have happened last week and recent weeks around the world, they are harbingers of a level of engagement on technology that the world has rarely witnessed. Governments are stepping up. Businesses and civil society groups and academics are stepping up. And most encouraging to me, the next generation of computer scientists and technologists are also stepping up. And not just to develop great AI systems, but to understand the implications of those systems and the things that we build on the world that we build them for. And how we can harness those developments for the betterment of our world. This is our moment. The potential for a technology like AI to promote human progress has never been greater. And the decisions we make now will lead us to a world where technology works in the service of a more free, open, equitable, and just society. And together, I know we can build that better version of our future. So thank you for inviting me today, and I really look forward to the conversation and questions.
Thank you so much, Alan Davidson, there for those thoughts. I'm just looking around the room to see, does anyone have any question for you? We've also since been joined by the Vice President of the European Commission, Věra Jourová, who'll be speaking in just a minute. She's already arrived in the building. Any thoughts there from the room? I mean, because Alan, you've been working obviously in tech for decades, since the mid-90s. So you're the right man for the job. But how there have the conversations, like the public policy conversations around AI, how do they compare to back then when the US government was regulating the internet?
Well, I don't know if the U.S. government was regulating the internet, but I think what's interesting is that it is it's quite different than where we were with the start of the internet. And I think the biggest difference here is that we're engaging a lot earlier. And I know it probably doesn't feel that way for folks who've been in this conversation for years, but I think if you were to look at sort of the early years of the internet or of the web, it took a lot longer for companies to engage. It took a lot longer for governments to engage. I think now you're seeing, companies, even smaller companies, who are building these very impactful models. They're showing up earlier in the conversation. They're hiring people to help them think about the implications of what they're working. And I think we have a much more sophisticated set of industry folks. We've got a much more sophisticated set of folks in civil society. And I would just argue that government is engaging quite a bit. You've seen it in just the last week, right? People are feeling the moment. We are feeling the moment, and we're showing up.
And what about the EU's AI Act? Have you been keeping an eye on that as well?
Of course we have. And I say with some admiration for the work that's been done. And I think it's been quite influential in the way that people around the world are thinking about it. At the same time, we've been working very, very closely with the European Union and the Commission on all of these efforts. It showed up in the G7 work that we're doing. I think you'll see shades of the same themes and ideas within the executive order that was just released. And I know that I'm sure that the Vice President will have a lot more to say about its progress moving forward. We are, of course, keenly watching it.
Absolutely, she certainly will. Well, Alan Davidson, thank you so much. We will say goodbye to you now because there are no more questions here in the room, as you can see. Thank you so much for being with us. Keep in touch and take care.
Thank you.
Applause there for Alan
Thank you all
Davidson.
for participating.
And as Alan said there, Věra Jourová has indeed entered the room and can come up and join us right up here on stage. Vice President of the European Commission, thank you so much for being with us and for concluding our conference. As we've been here all day, we've heard a lot, and we are all very curious now to hear what you have to say. Your name, as you can imagine, has been mentioned many times. The EU AI Act has been mentioned many times. We had some MEPs here as well, so now you can take the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for such a nice warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to be here. Changing the topic, we discussed the whole day about enlargement and a historical moment for the EU. And another historical moment for the EU is indeed how to handle the development of technologies, how to promote and support innovations, how to attract the brains to the EU to work on them, and of course also how to set the meaningful and proportionate rules. So I'm glad that Alan is watching because it's true that we cooperate with the United States quite intensively, and we have a lot to say to each other also under the Technology and Trade Council. And it's a little bit ungrateful task to be closing this conference because the whole day you are speaking about these things, so I am now a bit scared whether I can say something new to you. But I will try. After so many excellent contributions to all aspects of the global development of AI, what more I can possibly add? Perhaps maybe a little bit of a memory jogger. I can start by reminding you of how extraordinary this meeting today would have seemed to anybody living in the distant past. I speak about 2019. In the EU, there were ethical guidelines proposed by a high-level expert group on AI. I think it was already in 2018. And the OECD had adopted some principles on AI as well, but that was all about voluntary actions. So, legislation on AI, that was not on anybody's agenda. And discussing even the theoretical possibility of binding rules on a global level would have seemed positively absurd back then. Yet, here we are, a whole 4 years later, and the fact that AI is a proper subject for regulation is taken for granted. Of course, not everybody agrees with every approach, but voices still arguing that AI should not be regulated at all are getting fewer. The main reason for this is that AI in 2019, it is also very different from what we expected it to be a few years ago. Back then, we predicted that there would be a large number of autonomous cars on the roads by now. On the other hand, what we did not anticipate was ChatGPT. In the past, when a new technology came along, it always took quite some time before it was widely used. However, with digital technologies, the speed of deployment increased so much. ChatGPT was downloaded 100 million times in just 2 months after its launch. So creating guardrails for such fast emerging technologies becomes ever more urgent. And we are not starting from scratch, as we have been debating the AI Act for quite some time now. The European approach to digitization puts people first. There is a common line to everything we do. No matter how fast technologies evolve, they must always serve a human purpose and leave no one behind. The rights we enjoy as people must remain with us. I use the same optics when it comes to AI. Even though we are talking about technology, my approach is always to see things through the eyes of a human, a consumer, a voter, a citizen, because technology, regardless of how advanced it may be, has to remain human-centric and serve the people. In the EU, we are now in the finishing stages of adopting the AI Act. It addresses the risks that certain AI applications create in a proportionate manner. For high-risk uses of AI, it provides for a robust framework for risk management, market surveillance, and enforcement. The AI Act will intervene only where necessary, allowing AI to flourish, and flourish it will. This is partly because of constantly improving algorithms, but to a large extent it is because of the avalanche of data that we generate every day. In the EU, we have regulated the data economy to promote trustworthy data sharing. The Data Governance Act regulates voluntary data sharing structures like data intermediation and altruism. This will foster trust in data sharing and increase the availability of data for the common good. The Data Act introduces new rights for data access and portability, enabling the development of innovative digital solutions and enhancing competition, especially in favor of the many SMEs that offer services in the aftermarkets. In addition, we are creating European data spaces with strategic economic sectors and domains of public interest, such as health, environment, energy, agriculture, mobility, finance, or manufacturing. But we are not only improving our regulatory framework, we are also developing tools to better leverage our existing assets. For example, thanks to our investment in the last years, Europe has now become a leader in supercomputing, with 3 out of 5 most powerful supercomputers in the world, and the new ones to come. Seizing the opportunity, the Commission will propose an EU AI startup initiative, allowing startups to access Europe's supercomputers. But let me dwell for a moment on an aspect that is close to my heart, yet difficult to grasp. I am talking about the impact of AI on democracy. I am very often being asked whether our democracy, the way we understand democracy, can survive digital revolution. Now we speak about AI. It has to, but it has to be supported. The lifeblood of democracy is dialogue of real people. advancing your arguments, refuting other arguments, formulating interests, signaling readiness to compromise. All these communicative functions are the essence of the political life of a democracy. Since AI profoundly alters the way we communicate, it will have a huge impact on the functioning of our democratic institutions. It changes where we get our information from, who gets to decide which information is widely circulated, and whom we can trust. And there is a real risk that people will lose trust in what they see. Deepfakes have become so good that they often become I will not say the word. Indistinguishable.
Indistinguishable. Not an easy one.
That they often become uneasy to recognize, okay, from reality. This applies text to images to videos. We already had cases of the usage of deepfakes in several EU elections. To my regret, we are still not able to assess the impact on the elections, but we have to work further on better analysis. I always say that the elections have to remain the competition of real people, real visions, and not the competition of dirty methods and robots. And I think that it has to remain like that in the EU. That is why we were thinking about how to protect free and fair elections and democracy in broader context in the EU. We need an obligation to label artificially generated content and deepfakes in the AI regulation. We have already put some basic transparency requirement in the political ads regulation to know if AI was used to produce a political ad or not. Also, the Code of Practice on Disinformation provides a good example for collaboration to address systemic risks. Just this summer, I requested the signatories of the code to launch a dedicated working group on generative AI, which they are currently preparing. We will all have to get used to a world in which we can't believe everything we see online, no matter how plausible it looks. We need media literacy and we need AI literacy. We will have to get used to critically assessing the likelihood of what we see online being true. Let me now turn shortly to the title of today's conference, The International Dimension of AI. As AI does not stop at Europe's borders, we are working together with our international partners across the world to rapidly shape minimum global standards for the safe and ethical use of AI. Just recently, I managed to conclude what Margaret Vestager started, namely the G7 AI Code of Conduct. I also traveled only recently to China and Japan to discuss these issues, and we had good discussions at the UK AI Safety Summit last week. In September, President von der Leyen stressed that it is important to join forces with our partners to ensure a global approach to understanding the impact of AI in our societies. I have noted today that there is a great deal of support for international cooperation. It will be a long way before we get to a comprehensive international framework for AI. But every journey, no matter how long, starts with the first step. And if today's conference shows anything, it is that we have already taken the first step. Because the first step is acknowledging that you have to take action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Take a seat. I know it's been a very busy day for the European Commission, as you said, with the big news on enlargement and talks regarding the entry of Ukraine and Moldova to the European Union. Talks will kick off very soon after Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's trip to Kiev. But another news story that we're following very closely is the trialogues that are taking place on this AI Act. All eyes, of course, on the
Not
6th.
today, I hope.
On the 6th of December. That's what we're being told. With the political pressure on, of course, with the elections coming up, can you bring us behind the doors of those talks? What are the sticking points, and will they find agreement on these issues like the facial recognition, etc.?
First of all, it's fascinating work. Of course, I always hear the voices, do not overshoot, because the innovations and the people's motivation to develop the new, hopefully useful things should not be affected. But you want me to invite you to the kitchen of the co-legislators. So I believe we might have the last trialogue on the 6th of December. So you might get it for St. Nicholas Day. And we, in fact, if I summarize it, we still have 4 hanging things hanging in the air for conclusion. Now the technical teams are working days and nights on it. The first thing is what you indicated yourself, the biometrics and the usage of AI by the states, state actors, which means the security bodies, police, law enforcement side. We still need to clarify very precisely in the text what can be done, how the technologies can be used. And this is exactly the chapter where we appear in that battlefield between the priority of protection of privacy of individual people and security, which is the common interest of the society. When this happens, always it is a very difficult thing to calibrate the solution well. We still have to discuss what can be, how can the technology be used ex ante when the criminal action is underway or being prepared, especially we speak about terrorist acts or missing children and these kind of situations, how these technologies can be used ex post during the prosecution. We discuss very sensitive topic, how the AI can be used in migration for identification of the people. You know, these kind of extremely sensitive themes are on our table now, and I believe we will have a hopefully good solution. The second thing is the enforcement and implementation structure. So there are several ideas. We are discussing also this enforcement structure in relation to the new chapter, which is the third topic, which is the reaction on the development of generative AI, the foundation models and the smaller systems, because we believe that the enforcement structure should be well tailored on what will have to be done. And here we speak about very large capable models and smaller systems. So we have a tradition in the EU that in such cases we develop some entities enforcing the legislation on the central level in the EU and at the level of the member state. So that's the indication of where we might land. So that's enforcement, that's biometrics. Yes, of course, the new chapter on generative AI. I can tell you I have never experienced such a moment when the 3 co-legislators are drafting fresh new chapter in the legislation. Because always it's the proposal of the Commission and the co-legislators are improving or not the original proposal of the Commission. So we are drafting together. It's interesting. Of course, also we hear the voices. How can we regulate something which we don't know what it is?
That you can't define. I mean, that is what we heard so many times today. You know, there was a lot of warnings from business, from industries, from startups, saying, slow down. If you're not clear of the definition, how can you actually regulate it to make sure you don't slam the door on creativity and innovation?
We don't speak about prohibitions. We speak about better control and better managing of the possible risks from the side of the developers.
I'm just going to look around the room to see, are there any questions from the floor? We have a gentleman there, yeah, representing the startups. Do you use AI on a daily basis?
I don't use computer.
You don't use...
Forget it. It's my horrible Czech joke.
We need a joke, I think.
Good evening.
Just introduce yourself. I know we've met you earlier, but just so the...
Envoy from a startup which is called Wasati. We are providing, in fact, AI governance capabilities. You are in charge of values and transparency. And we see, and all the day, was to talk about transparency through the overall day. But one of the problems that we talked about was to measure and to provide some metrics. The problem is I see values as something which is continuously moving and evolving. And even if we say and claim that Europe citizens have some values and we want to defend those values, the problem is we have more definition about values than we have about AI. So how do you deal with that? How to define values in a way that we can measure that and see if we are progressing?
How do you define values, right?
To measure it, to measure them.
To measure them.
Measure them.
Not an easy question. You see, we can, as we, like, there's so many layers to this, right? As you peel off another layer, the more complexities arise.
Dear sir, I would love to have met you 5 years ago. You would advise me. Because when I got the portfolio of values and transparency, of course you cannot measure values. You can measure the success in fiscal policy or maybe something connected with economy. But values are here to be assessed and to be respected and to be supported. And when I speak about the values, I speak about universal values which do not, which are not limited by ideologies. So you can imagine I'm dancing on the eggs every day. But that's why, because I work in this sphere of values so many years, I always wanted to be present in developing of the regulations for the digital sphere and AI. Because I believe that we have to be extremely vigilant and careful not to create a system which will demolish everything which the people created for themselves for well-being over decades, sometimes centuries. What I have in mind, discrimination must not happen. I always speak about the need to be absolutely careful not to copy-paste the imperfections from the real world into the AI sphere. And it concerns discrimination, it concerns the different security problems. The social scoring must not contain any kind of unequal treatment. In relation to AI, I really have a big concern that we have to manage to keep the human rights for human beings. It's my big topic, because just imagine if we share with the robots the freedom of speech, and I am pushing the digital platforms to remove illegal content, and there is always a problem, because the freedom of speech has the priority in the EU. But I am convinced that we have to protect the freedom of speech of real people. Mr. Nobody, without the legal personality, should not have this right. The same comes to copyright. And I could continue. So I think that we should avoid something I call theft of human rights. What was developed for human beings should remain for them.
Okay. Oh, we have one more question there. Gentleman in the white shirt.
Hi, thanks. I'm Conor Dunlop. I'm from the Ada Lovelace Institute. I know you were at Bletchley Park last week, Commissioner. So my feeling with everything going on in the UK is that they've done quite a good job of identifying some of the risks, but they're not doing as much to actually take the next step and mitigate them with regulation. So this is what we can do with the AI Act. So I was wondering, do you have a key takeaway from your conversations at Bletchley? Mm-hmm. And has this sort of updated at all your thinking around how we can do to solve some of those challenges in the AI Act?
Yeah, in Bletchley, it was, I think, a very, very important moment that we met and that we discussed where we are. There was also Gina Raimondo from the United States and many other important people who who have influence on whether to regulate or not in different countries, even different continents. What I received as a message from the UK was something I heard many times when they still were the member country. Let's wait and see. And so in UK, I heard that they want to take more sectoral approach to address the risks which can appear in different sectors, rather than horizontal piece of legislation similar to AI Act. With UK, I think that there is a promising way of space for cooperation, which we are now discussing. First thing is the cooperation between the researchers, because the UK announced the institute, the research institute for AI. The same we had with the US. We also will have a very strong research platform which we want to establish on the basis of AI Act. And I believe that it should not be very clever if three are doing the same thing. So I believe that there might be synergy and cooperation. And the second thing what the UK proposed to us was cooperation on testing methodology, which might be also very useful. So there was a lot of practical ideas, and we can do together much more than alone.
Kind of out of time. Is it really urgent? This gentleman has posed about 10 questions today. He came very, very prepared to the conference. Christoph, this will be your last question, and that will conclude the conference, and then we all have a well-deserved drink together.
I will faint, and it will be the end.
Hi, Christoph Singh, AAA.AI Association. Actually, I was also in Bletchley Park, but I was outside and just walking around, and I met these people.
It was raining.
It was raining, yeah.
Sorry.
But there were also people protesting, and they had quite, some of them had quite radical points of view about AI. So I had quite interesting conversation with them, and they were advocating for something that's called pause, right? I just wanted to know if, of course, things went somehow one day out of control, is it on the EU's table to, say, pause? Yeah.
To pause what? The innovations, or to pause regulation?
No, to pause the innovations, right? They were talking about the innovations. So if it went out of control one day.
I would not like to live in Europe which can pause innovations. But we want to support innovations which are safe. And I think that's the main philosophy of everything we are doing. And so I could also speak about all the programs and financial supporting programs which we are preparing or which are already running, how we support the blending of private and public money which is needed in this sphere. We still have a gap compared with China and US. So of course the gap also contains the investment gap. So vice versa, we want to support innovations, but at the same time, I believe that this is a very rational approach, that we develop the rules which set the parameters for safety for the AI technologies.
Okay, Věra Jourová, Vice President of the European Commission, thank you so much for being with us. A round of applause.
Thank you very much.
You are, of course, the final speaker of the day, and that, ladies and gentlemen, brings the International AI Summit 2023 to an end, organised, of course, by Forum Europe and by Euronews. You might have noticed Euronews reporters were roaming around the room today, catching some sound bites, taking some of the best lines that you heard today, so do look out for that over the next few days on Euronews and, of course, on Euronews Online. All that's left to do is wish you a lovely evening. I'll see you downstairs, hopefully now. Those that are in the room for the networking drink, enjoy Brussels. Those that are visiting, take care and keep talking about AI. We'll keep following about it. And at Euronews, of course, we will keep reporting about it. Thank you so much for your attention. You've been a fantastic audience. Bye-bye.